Sourdough starters. Sourdough is a concept I love. Although it is one that confused and eluded me for years, it seemed like a daunting task to keep and use a starter. In the beginning, I tried many different methods to get a batch going without using commercial yeast. Commercial yeast is potentially GMO and just seemed unnatural to me. I wanted to catch a wild yeast, the real thing. So, in my many attempts of getting a starter going, I tried setting my flour mixture outside in the green grass for 2 weeks. I tried using fresh plum skins. I tried mixing fresh smashed grapes with their bloomy skins in the beginning starter. I tried rye flour. I tried potato water. I tried adding extra sugar. You name it, I tried it. Failure. Every time. It's very frustrating. I had also heard of using dairy kefir to get a sourdough starter going. This worked, but if you can't eat dairy, the dairy kefir is a big no no. Then I tried using water kefir to start my sourdough. It also worked, but it just didn't hit me as being the right method, and I'm not sure why, but it didn't give the results I was looking for. Finally, one day, a friend named Ellie suggested using a piece of fresh cabbage to get my starter going. Suddenly, the light went on. Why not? It works for sauerkraut. So I gave it a try. Beautiful. We now had sourdough without using commercial yeast. It takes about 3 days to come to life and for bubbles to begin forming in the flour mixture. And in 7 days, it's ready to go. At this point, I have been able to get a wild air caught natural yeast sourdough going. I have a friend that also has an Alaskan starter that I've also used, which is really beautiful. And with the cabbage variety, it is a little different than your other wild caught sourdoughs. I have found that catching a wild yeast works better in the summer or warmer weather. Now, having used them all for many years now, I actually like them all, but my very favorite is the Wild Start, and it seems to be the most hearty. The cabbage is a nice backup if all else fails. The next hurdle was having too much starter. It was coming out my ears. I wasn't experienced enough in using starter for bread, so I made pancakes. It's all I knew how to make. You can only eat so many sourdough pancakes. The other problem is that I wanted to see if I could keep the starter on the countertop, not the refrigerator. Keeping it in the fridge slows down its growth. For those who are new to sourdough, many people will feed their starter and then put it back in the fridge for the week. Then, when they need to use the starter, they will get it out of the fridge, feed it, allow it to warm up, and start bubbling again. This takes several hours. This seemed pesky to me. I didn't want to keep my starter in the refrigerator and then have to wait for it to warm up every time I needed to use it. I didn't have that much time. Thus came the aha moment. Stop feeding the sourdough so much. Truly, if you feed a pet too much, it grows a lot, outward. If you feed your sourdough too much, it grows too, outward and upward. So I found that feeding my baby a tiny bit of flour and a tiny bit of water each day was just right, considering if you only use your sourdough once or twice a week, which was perfect for me as a newbie to baking with sourdough. In feeding the sourdough these tiny meals, it could live on the countertop and not have to be retired to the refrigerator. Now, if you are a person who bakes a lot, you may find that you need to feed your sourdough a lot more. You'll figure out how much you need to feed your sourdough baby when you start baking. If you don't have enough starter, feed it more flour and water. If you're swimming in the stuff, feed it less flour and water. Mainly, just make sure to use your starter at least once a week. This keeps it fresh and prevents it from building up too much and getting too sour. If you don't use your sourdough starter, it will continue to sit in the jar and get really sour. If you like really sour bread, this is perfect. If you don't like really sour bread, just pour out most of the starter and feed your baby a bunch more flour and water. Allow it to rest for a few hours, and this will, what they call, sweeten the pot and give you sweet, fresh, new sourdough again. Over the years, I have found that you can use any type of flour you want in your sourdough starter. My favorites have typically been brown rice flour and whole spelt flour. Most people use all purpose white flour, which is wheat, or whole wheat flour. Some people meticulously measure out their sourdough mama ingredients and weigh them on a scale. This is excellent, but I don't. I just memorized what the consistency of the sourdough starter needs to be. The sourdough starter made with all purpose flour is going to be different than the spelt starter or the brown rice starter. The brown rice starter has a consistency more like store bought peanut butter It's kind of creamy, it's thick. Spelt sourdough is thick too, but more like a very thick cake batter. And the white flour starter, the wheat all purpose version, is more like a cake batter. Now, I like to stir my sourdough with a cooking chopstick. It's a regular chopstick, but it's really long. And they're pretty stout, pretty sturdy, and they work really well for stirring sourdough. So that's something to look for when you get started. So a few years ago, I wrote up a silly description of the sourdough mama or baby to help others understand what makes her happy. But instead of just writing it out, you're going to get a video instead. All right, I call this If Sourdough Mama Ain't Happy, Ain't No Bread Happy. So, keeping a happy sourdough mama is the key to making delicious breads and baked goods. In other words, if you have a happy sourdough mama, then you'll have happy bread. Here's how to keep a happy sourdough mama. Try to use flour that has the texture of fine, fine cornmeal flour. It should be slightly coarse and slightly grainy. Fine ground flour, when it's like a super fine powder, can make for an unhappy sourdough mama and dense, heavy breads. If your mama isn't thriving, try using whole flour. She likes nutrition too. Texture, consistency, thickness is extremely important. I would describe the texture of the gluten-free brown rice sourdough mama as a very thick cake batter or like a creamy peanut butter. It will hold a chopstick straight up. It is thick. Now, if this mama is runny or liquidy, this is not good. Your mama should come out of the jar into a measuring cup in a fairly thick mass, almost like a kind of soft clump. If it pours out like thin cake batter or water, this is not good. If your mama doesn't have many bubbles and there is a layer of water resting on top, your mama is too thin. Add more flour. When mama is happy, she will have lots of bubbles and hold her shape in the jar. She won't separate into layers or sit like mud at the bottom of your jar. She's a bubbly gal. Mama likes to be fed every day or two. If you let her rest for a day, feed her a fair amount of flour and a little water before using mama in the recipe. This will lessen the tartness of mama and your bread. Now, if you are trying to make bread that's like the commercial type with the wheat flour, you want to let your mama sit overnight. Don't mix flour right into the starter right before you use it. So I usually feed mama right before baking with the gluten-free starters. This helps cut down on the sour taste in your baked goods, which is great if your family's particularly picky about that. This is particularly good for brown rice flour starters. If your breads are tasting really tangy and sour after a regular rest, your mama is too tangy and sour. Feed her some flour and water before using her in a recipe. If your mama is exceptionally sour and strong smelling, pour most of your mama out and keep a couple of tablespoons. Then feed her a bunch of floured water. Mix well and let her bubble again. She'll return to her sweet self. If mama develops a pink scum on the top, scoop that off, going about an inch down, and throw the top layer away. Then feed her some more flour and water. Mix well and use as usual. And I will say, in working a full-time job, sometimes I have let mama sit on the counter for several days and did not feed her. She was just fine, but she had a very crusty, black, nasty-looking layer on the top, so I just pull that off, go down about an inch, shovel that out, and start with a new jar and new flour, new water, and make sure you have some of the old mama starter in there and just let her go, and it's always fine. So keep in mind that a gluten-free sourdough mama will not act like a wheat flour sourdough mama. So again, pick which flour you want to use and know that they are going to be different. If you're getting ready to make a recipe and don't have enough mama, just feed her more flour and water. Keep in mind that all your flour is going to soak or ferment anyway while it sits there for 8 hours or so fermenting. So you just need enough good bacteria present in the mama to make the fermentation happen. Now, you don't want to overdo this little stretch. You don't want too little bacteria in your bread or mama. Keep mama warm between 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Mama does not need darkness. Mama does need to breathe, so keep a mesh linen or cotton cloth on the top of the jar secured with a rubber band. Do not feed Mama chlorinated water at all. It will send her to an early grave. Use bottled water, a filter, or purchased water if you must to avoid chlorine. When baking, try to use large amounts of Mama at a time. Don't let large amounts of Mama remain in the jar. If you do, she will get really sour and will not make tasty breads. If you are really baking a lot every day or every other day, then keep a big Mama on hand. If you rarely bake, then keep a little Mama on hand. If you don't bake a lot, then you might have to put Mama in the refrigerator. Bring her out once a week, let her warm up, feed her a bunch of flour and water, and allow her to bubble up. This may take a couple of days. Then put her breathable cap back on and place her back in the fridge. Now, when you have the sourdough Mama mixed into your flour and you have your dough, and you're getting ready to let it rest, there are a certain amount of time that you typically let it rest. 4 hours is the minimum ferment time you want, which is it's barely sour and barely fermented. 6 to 8 hours is pleasantly soured, and this is what I generally do. 10 hours or more can be very tangy and quite sour, but I do have a few recipes that I will even push to 20 hours, 24 hours for some of my very favorite spelt breads and some of my non. So this was just a quick little introduction to sourdough. We'll get into some recipes and some other things later. But I just want to recap and just say that you can use any flour that you want to use in a sourdough Mama. Again, my favorites are spelt flour, whole spelt flour, and whole brown rice flour. And I have many friends that like to use the white flour. That is not something that I use because our household tends to be gluten-free or close to gluten-free. And so I typically do not use the white flour, even though it makes absolutely beautiful breads. But if you want to use millet flour or rye flour or anything that you can think of, oat flour, there's a gluten-free oat flour, anything will work in a Mama. So that is the beautiful thing about sourdough. So just know that there's a lot of possibilities with it. So we'll get on to some recipes soon. Enjoy.